Thank you, Terry. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Scott. I just want to take a quick moment and say how exciting it is to have these 2 days with you all. And in general, to say there are exciting things happening in New Mexico when it comes to responding to domestic violence. We're really excited to be able to share this with you. This is as much for everyone in the state of New Mexico and all the programs, member programs, community resources, our partners and collaborators, as it is for everyone else. And we encourage you to stay engaged. If you can, keep your camera on or turn your camera on from time to time just to let us know. And it's always good for the speakers to be able to see your face as well and to engage with you in this new medium that is kind of the new normal. But keep the chat going, keep your questions coming, and we're confident that you're going to enjoy today, find it edifying. And Scott, we're excited to have you here, and I'm going to just go ahead and turn it over to you. We'll get you spotlighted, and you'll be sharing your screen, and take it away.
All right, thanks, David. So I just want to say that New Mexico is doing some exciting stuff around DV. So just to reiterate what David's talking about, because I get to work with places all over the country on CCR work, and so the way that New Mexico is approaching this issue, I think, could end up being like a model for other states, including the one I live in, on how to approach this work as a statewide coalition. So kudos to all of you. All right, so what we're going to do, we've got this hour session, we've got another hour session. The next one's going to be more specifically on working with government agencies, and how we do that and how we think about that and why we do that. But this one's more about just kind of getting the nuts and bolts, as David said, of a CCR down within an hour. So this is a 3.5-day training that we're boiling into 2 hours. So we got a lot to cover. So Jeff, my colleague, is going to run the slideshow here. Next slide, Jeff. All right. So many of you might have heard about the Duluth model. The Duluth model actually is an organizing method. It isn't a men's curriculum. It isn't a police policy, but it's how all of those things were organized. Right. So Ellen Pence, who was the founder of this agency back in 1980, developed an organizing method coming out of social change movements that resulted in this particular model, which builds intervention within systems and institutionalizes those changes. And we'll talk more about what all that means. It has tools, it has strategies about how to approach the problems that we learn victims have when they try to ask for help within a community, whether it be from a faith-based community, whether it be from the government agencies, or whether it be from community-based agencies. This method of organizing works across systems, and that's what it's for. All right, next slide, Jeff. So when you think about what we're going to be talking about, the Duluth model approach, the method of organizing, is what creates the coordinated community response, or the version of it that we're going to be talking about. And within that coordinated response are a host of agencies, which you see a smattering of here. There are twice as many of these in our actual response, but this is what I could fit on a slide. And you have everything from 911, law enforcement, and jail, to the restorative justice sentencing, restorative circles, and the men's nonviolence program, the women's nonviolence program. All those different programs, community and government, are linked within that coordinated response in a specific way that we'll be talking about. All right, next slide, Jeff. So what do we mean when we say coordinated community response? An interagency effort to change the climate of tolerance of battering or coercive control by institutionalizing practices, procedures, which centralize victim safety and offender accountability in domestic assault cases. Okay, so when you have a man come into a men's group, especially one who has moved from someplace else, he's lived in another place, and now he's living in Duluth, and he commits a domestic assault, right? comes into men's group and he says, wow, I mean, my probation officer's like knocking on my mom's door trying to find out if I'm actually like, what is this place here, right? What's going on here? That's the kind of thing that we want people to understand. Another guy lived in a big metropolitan area, moves here, and he said, you know, where I lived, I could slap my girlfriend around all I wanted, right? The cops aren't going to even show up much as do anything. But here, if I want to live here with the woman that I'm in love with, I got to change what I'm doing because it isn't tolerated here, right? That's the kind of impression we want a coordinated response to make on a community, that this community's taken a stand, both government, non-governmental agencies come together, take a stand, and we aren't going to tolerate this kind of abuse happening to our community members. So we don't coordinate, we coordinate to change the climate of tolerance for this kind of thing that's happening in the community. All right, next slide, Jeff. All right, so there's 3 layers that you can think about around that ultimately end in coordination. Coordination has collaboration, it has integration, but collaboration doesn't have the other 2, right? The way that I'm going to talk about it. So collaboration is the notion when agencies respond to phone calls. I call up the investigator and they call me back. They come to meetings. They respond to information requests that you might have. And there's a generally good relationship. That's collaboration. That's maybe where a community can start this work, right? Because it's good to have that. Integration builds on that a little bit more. There's typically a formal way that information gets shared. There's cross-reporting. They might go out on calls together or make decisions together. And then you have integration. Coordination is actually taking integration to the next step. So now, instead of just sharing information, we're going to coordinate how that information gets shared. So here's an example. From 2015 to 2019, I did work in Australia. And what they call CCR is an integrated response. They gave me the impression that what they meant by integrated response is the same thing we mean by coordinated community response. But when I actually started digging into it, I started realizing that they're at the level of what we call integration. So the word was appropriate. So here's the thing. They didn't have a way of sharing information the first year I was there. Next year, they passed legislation, and now they have this law that says the courts can share information. So I'm sitting in a room with everybody from the health sector, community-based advocates, criminal justice agencies, the courts, small units of government, all that's in the room, right? And the courts say, we can now share this information. I say, how do you do it? Well, we get it all together every day and we push it out to everybody, okay? So then I said to the health sector, what percent of information that you get from them do you actually use? And they said about 20%. So I said, you're sifting through 80% of information that really isn't relevant to the work that you do. No. Then I went to the next, right? And they all had a similar way of talking about it. I said, okay, so when I say coordination, this is what I mean. So if this legislation would have been passed in Minnesota, for example, we would have said before it gets implemented, we'd have said, okay, so now the courts can share all this information. So what we need to do is work out who needs what, in what format do they need it so they can actually use it and understand it, and then how timely does it need to be, because it changes across different agencies. So we would have redesigned that system so that the only thing people were getting is what they can use. They would have received it in a format that they designed, right? That would have been implemented at the courts, and then they would receive it in a timely way so that they can actually use it, right? So in Duluth, for example, we have somebody who shows up at the police department and they pull all law enforcement from multiple jurisdictions, arrests, and they do a risk file on that guy. By 9:30 a.m., a risk file on every arrested individual goes to DHS, CPS, Child Protection, all criminal justice agencies that are making decisions prior to arraignment, which is the courts, pretrial release, and prosecution. And then advocates have access to that also. So now everybody who's making a decision on this individual at the very first appearance all has the same information, but it's all formatted different. What the courts get is formatted differently than what the prosecution gets, right? Than what pretrial release gets, because they all needed it in a different way. That's what coordination is. That's what it takes. Sorry, I just lost myself there for a second. All right, next slide, Jeff. And next slide, Jeff. Thank you. All right, so within our response, what I thought I would do, given the time that we have, is just kind of cover some of the, as David said, which was helpful to my presentation, the nuts and bolts. If you were to take up what holds everything together, right? And there's a ton that goes with each one of these things and in between them, but these are really the frame that holds it together. So one is a shared understanding of the problem. Imagine if in your community, everybody who was responding to these problems understood the problem the same way. What would change, right? If they all understood it the same way, right? A method of sharing information within the CCR, a formal, organized, coordinated way of sharing information, just as we talked about. Centering survivors within systemic change. In other words, if we're going to change something, and I get this question a lot, what should be our agenda? Where should we start? Where should you start? You should start with asking women in your community, when they call for help, what happens, right? What happens that's helpful? What happens that isn't helpful, that makes them less safe, that makes them not want to call again, right? There's your agenda for change, right? And every community has survivors. Every community has an agenda, but they haven't taken the step to find out what that is by doing these focus groups. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I think we'll get to that. Discover the source of the systemic problems. There are problems in every one of your communities, but it is fascinating to me that when I start looking at what the source of them are, it's typically never what we think it is. It's always something else. A really quick example. I go into our domestic violence response team in the police department. The investigators are furious with the city attorney's office. They're mad because they say the city attorney's office does not care about domestic violence cases. I said, why? What makes you think that? Because we have arrest warrants out for individuals that they need to sign, and we can't do anything with until we get it back from them. And they sit on these things for a month, and we're ready to get them now. They don't care, okay? So as the person who coordinates the organizing, I can't take that judgment on because I don't know what's true and what's not, right? So I go up to the prosecutor's office. I said, hey, Carrie Schmees was the prosecutor. I said, do you have a moment to just kind of show me? I've never really learned how you use or how you process warrant requests. And I didn't tell him why I'm there. I didn't tell him where I got this information. I'm just there to try and figure this out, right? So Carrie brings me into a room. There's a clipboard, and there's an in and an out. And I look down the sheet, in, out, all within 2 to 3 days tops, right? Okay, so how is it that they're processing these things in 2 to 3 days and they're not getting them for a month? I said, okay, Carrie, so when you do the warrant request, where do you take it? Case system mapping, right? It's a really short version of it. So he walks me out to the front desk, and there's a person sitting there who is responsibility to do administrative duties. And I said, I introduced myself. I said, okay, so you get these warrant requests from the attorneys. What do you do with them when you get them? And she said, oh, I put them in a stack here on my desk, and once a month I bring them down to the police department. Okay, right. So the problem, the source of the problem was that nobody told this administrative person that when they get these warrant requests, they have to be done on a daily basis down to the police department, right? It isn't because they don't care. It isn't because they are callous to the problem. It was a mistake in how they organized the movement of paper through their office, which is so often the problem, right? It's not malice. It's not caring. It's some systemic problem that nobody sees because they're operating in a silo. They don't see what happens outside of the silo that they work in. Okay. Partnering on institutional changes, which involve creating policy, protocols, and structural shifts across the coordinated response. That's what when we say coordinated response, we're talking about agencies actually doing work to change how their workers respond to these cases and institutionalizing it in policy and protocol, right? That way, when the individual leaves, the head of that department leaves, the policies are still in place. There's a sustainability to the response. We've been doing this in Duluth for 40 years. Everybody in our police department, including the chief of police, who's going to retire in a month, has never worked as an officer without this domestic violence policy that we developed in 1980 and have built on over the years. A solid understanding of how agencies organize workers. We're going to talk briefly about that, but it is more than policy and protocol. And if you're going to change the way an agency operates, you have to take into account all the things that influence a worker's actions. Evaluating the effectiveness of those changes, right? You want to actually know if what you did had the desired impact, and then an individual or agency to coordinate the work. Somebody needs to be tasked to do this. And this is one of the biggest gaps across the US in doing CCR work, is that agencies have given this as an add-on to, for example, an advocate, or they've hired a coordinator who has administrative skills in a criminal justice agency to coordinate the work, and they're not organizers, and they don't have they don't have the time, especially when it's an add-on to another job, to do the work. You really need, this is full-time, this is more than full-time work. So somebody needs to be tasked with this job, or it's unlikely to happen the way that we're talking about it. All right, next slide, Jeff. Next slide, Jeff. Oh, Terry? Teresa's.
Yes.
Oh, good. Thank you. All right, good. Jeff's like, it's not me. It's not me.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Okay. All right. So battering in the crime domestic assault. So in the treatment end of the domestic violence space, there's a lot of conversation that they don't like the word battering. And I've heard all the reasons. I get all of that. When you're on the organizing end of the space, it becomes a lot more problematic to call what these typically men are doing as harm, because it doesn't specify the difference between what he's doing to her and what she might do in response to him, which could be also be illegal. So one of the things that you learn here, for example, this is a quote from Ellen Pence and Shamita Dasgupta's paper on responses to domestic violence and kind of the history around this, is that when everything became about domestic violence as a term became a gender neutral term, and everything looked the same to the practitioners. So when somebody was arrested for a domestic assault, her violence looked just like his violence, and the consequences were the same. And we know that if you impose a consequence on somebody who's already marginalized within a space, it further marginalizes that person and actually elevates the ability of the person doing the oppressing in that space to be more able to exercise what they want. So here's an example. You've got a woman in Duluth, and she's been beat for years by this guy. She's now been beat again. The police show up, blood all over her face, bleeding from eyes, nose, and mouth. And when they get him under control, secure the scene, she picks up a coffee cup off the table, throws it at him, hits him in the face. That's assault. Okay? There's no way around that. misdemeanor domestic assault for him, misdemeanor domestic assault for her. How then do you differentiate questions of justice given what she did and why she did it versus what he's been doing and why he's been doing it, right? You have to have a way to help practitioners differentiate the intent and the context of the crime that falls under the statute of domestic assault, right? So the next slide, Jeff. Or next slide, Teresa. So what we do when we're organizing within a response, there are three types of domestic assault. There's battering and coercive control. There's resistive violence that comes out of that. And then there's everything else that falls under the statute. And what we're concerned about is somebody who's battering using coercive control or somebody who's using resistive violence because they're being battered. And those have to be investigated in specific ways to have the evidence to know whether or not you've got one or the other, right? And that gives the confidence to the practitioner to know what they're dealing with and what justice should look like. So we have a paper that one of our prosecutors here in Duluth, who's now recently retired, has written about how to think about that as an attorney, right? I've got a similar crime. How am I legally justified in treating them dissimilarly, right? And there's a way to do that. The power of the state should be restricted to the illegal activity of the offender. She shouldn't be mandated to do things because she's a victim of his violence, right? Survivors are rarely free to cooperate with the system to hold offenders accountable. Account for power differences between survivor and offender. All right, so police, they walk in. By policy, they are not to interview the survivor or the victim in this case, given the language of the system, and the offender in the same space, right? That's accounting for the power he has over her. If you want evidence for what's going on, he can't be standing next to her as you're interviewing her, right? On the far end, that's the arrest end. On the far end, he gets ordered to a men's program. How does the men's program account for power differences? We don't send guys home with assignments to do with her because we don't know what level of power he maintains over her. So all assignments that we do with guys in the program are focused on them and don't involve her. Because when we did focus groups with women, they told us repeatedly, don't send him home to me to do a good thing because he doesn't do it, right? He still wants his way. He's still going to do what he's going to do, but now I have to deal with it and you've sanctioned it because it's his homework, right? So again, every step of the CCR takes up these shared understandings within the space that they operate. Those who batter are responsible for stopping their violence, period. Somebody, it isn't alcohol. It isn't that he's got a partner who's angry and threw something. If he is battering her, right, it is his responsibility to stop the violence. And there's no other excuse for it, right? Because this isn't domestic violence. This is battering. This is something different. This is an ongoing pattern of violence to dominate another human being, right? And if somebody's doing that, there is no bad behavior that justifies it. So the focus needs to be on who the person is perpetrating the battering. Okay, Teresa, next slide, please. All right, so let's look at method of sharing information with the response. And making decisions, practitioners are only as good as the information they have. Okay, we can get absolutely frustrated as community agencies when we sit in a courtroom and we listen to a judge make a decision. And we think, how could they possibly let this guy off for whatever was in front of them? But when you actually sit down with judges, one of the things that you hear is, You know, I sit up on that bench and I look into this courtroom and I know everybody in this room knows 10 times more about what's going on than I do. There are all kinds of legal limits to what I can know and make a decision from. But yet I'm the one they're going to point the finger at and say, why did you make the decision you made? If you want me to make a better decision as a judge, then get me better information and respect due process. So in Duluth, that took us 2 years to figure out how to get all this risk and context information collected, analyzed, and to the judge before 11 a.m. Arraignment, so that they had something that the defense could have, prosecution has, and they have to make decisions by. You want people to make better decisions, get them better information, right? The information sharing needs to be designed routinely and flow by policy and protocol. It can't be because Elizabeth is responsible as long as she's not on vacation to get you what you need. That's not going to work. So you need to, so this is the structural change, right? You need to change the way that paperwork, the way that information, and now I should probably say paperwork, I've been doing this too long, the way information gets shared from one agency to the next. It has to be routine. It has to be part of a protocol or even policy that says, when you get this information, these are the places that it goes, right? Information needs to be useful for those receiving it. It needs to be timely for those receiving it. And risk information needs to be, as I said, collected, analyzed, and distributed across the CCR so that everybody from advocates to the judge to child protection knows who they're dealing with, what their history of violence is, and what risks they pose to her or her and the kids, right? Again, this is something you can begin to see why I say this is a full-time job. This isn't something you're going to add onto somebody's job for 20 hours a week and think you're going to get very far, right? This has to be somebody's position. All right, next slide, Jeff. Centering survivors and institutional change initiatives. As I said earlier, right? As long as I have done this work, I sit in a focus group and I'm blown away by things that I had never considered, that I did not know, insights that they have on how things could be better, right? It never stops, right? The most rich places that I learn from are sitting with the victims of this violence, talking about the way that they navigate the community to be safe and where the places are that they have to avoid because it's not safe to go there. It's not safe to talk to them. It's not safe to call them because of how their response is, right? There's your agenda for change, right? And we have to go in as a community, understanding that every agency to be coordinated is going to have to change something, right? So I'll just raise my hand and say, as an advocate, as part of that community, right? We have a tendency to think that as advocates, we're good. It's everybody else who needs to change, right? But every time we change a piece in the system, we likely are going to have to change something that we do and how we do it within our agency. Because think of it as a giant puzzle. You're trying to get all the pieces to fit together. One piece doesn't get to say, I'm not changing my shape, but everybody else has to and still fit in. It doesn't work that way, right? So we're all going to these focus groups and learning from survivors about their experience with the assumption that we are going to shift something that we're doing. That's just the given, right? The focus groups will also give you evidence that goals have been achieved. So once you do all of that and you go back to survivors who've experienced the new response that you put together, then you ask them, right? Did we achieve our goal? One of the most poignant things for me, as in the work I've done here, is we have done work for decades on improving safety and the ability of systems to hold him accountable. And I mean, not just government systems, but I mean like churches to hold him accountable, to get him into a program, incentivize him to go someplace he didn't want to go for rehab, right? So I'm sitting in this meeting or this focus group, and I said, all right, so one of the goals that we've had is safety, to make it safer for you. Do you think that we've achieved this? And they had different ways of talking about, yeah, I think that's right. But then I said, are we a resource to you as a community response? And that was a completely different answer. No. Okay. So if we were going to be a resource to you, what would have to change? And they said, there has to be something for me. Everybody wants something from me. They want information. They want me to show up. They want me to do this. They want me to do that. But nobody's calling me to say, what do you need? Right? Until we get a focus group like this, and then somebody's asking me what I think. But it's too late. If you want to be a resource to me, then have somebody there for what I need. Do you have any examples of that? Yeah, I have an example. Tate on the domestic violence response team, who's an investigator. He's a resource to me. Okay, so how? Well, because he's gotten to know me. Like the first time he got arrested, that was the first time I talked to him. And I didn't really trust him and I didn't really talk to him much. But the second time he got arrested, I already kind of knew him. And now I talked to him, and he arrested the guy, you know, my boyfriend, who was running from the police on a warrant, but I knew where he was. But I could trust to call Tate, tell him where he was, and know Tate's not going to out me to him. So the places that were a resource to victims in our response were the places that we had dedicated personnel to domestic violence, dedicated law enforcement investigators to domestic violence, dedicated prosecutors, dedicated probation agents. In those venues, those individuals became a resource to her, right? So again, are we making things safer? Yeah. Are you a resource? Not so much, right? Needs a lot of work. And then maintain an ongoing survivor advisory group while organizing taking place. So you've got this group of women that you can call on, and all these women get compensated for their time. So I don't want you to think this is all like free volunteer stuff. They get compensated, and you bring them together and say, okay, we're thinking about an idea here, right? And this is our draft of it. What do you all think? Nope, not going to work. Almost always. That's the initial response. So then how do we need to change it to make it work? And what are the factors we're not taking into account, right? So we have in Minnesota, we have a law called a DANCO, Domestic Abuse No Contact Law, right? And in it, there is nothing that requires the system to tell the victim that a DANCO has been issued against the offender. So we wanted to build in a way to let her know, and if she knew, would she want it modified in any particular way, like an order for protection before it gets issued, right? So I sit down with all my decades of experience and with Tara, another advocate, and we write up this thing that's going to go on the police rights, victim rights card that every victim gets at the scene of a crime. We write it up, we bring it to the advisory group, and we say, so what do you think? And they look and say, no, like literally threw it across the table and said, that's not going to work. Okay, so I'm feeling like, well, I think I got some insight, it isn't that bad, is it? Right? And I said, so what's the problem with it? And they said, Scott, it's 2 a.m. You got 2 pages here. I can guarantee you 100% I'm not reading 2 pages. So if you don't have a way of shortening this up, I don't have access to it. I said, okay, so could you all in the advisory group take the content and pare it down to what you think is important to write in this? They did they cut it to 1/3. And now what is in our victim rights card was written by survivors for survivors at the scene of a crime. That's the goal. That's what you get when you partner and you center survivors in the work that you're doing. All right, next slide, Teresa. All right, so now we're going to cover this particular slide more in the next hour, but this is basically the process that we go through. This could take, as I gave you an example, a few weeks to figure out. This could take you 5 years to figure out, depending on the complexity of the problem that you're figuring. But these are the steps we go through to solve problems within the CCR. The one we're going to look at is identify sources of the problem, which is the purple box in the steps. So you can see, identify the problem on the far left, expand understanding of the problem, and then come to the ability to identify the actual source of the problem that gets identified. Next slide, Jeff, or next slide, Teresa. All right. If you go back one, Teresa, just before I leave that. Here's an example, just so I can ground this for you. We did a series of focus groups in a different community than Duluth that we were doing some work in. And one of the things that came up was that probation had not talked to any of the women that we had in focus groups. So was kind of amazing, right? Like not one of them had ever been contacted by probation. When we talked to the advocates and we asked them how well probation does at talking to victims, they said they're great. They're fantastic. They're really helpful. Okay, so then how come nobody has talked to them, yet they're really good at doing this, right? So we go to the probation supervisor. We said, all right, so what's your, do you have a protocol or a standard that you have out for contacting survivors after a domestic assault has taken place? And they said, yeah, they're supposed to make 3 attempts at the calls. Okay, so how does that happen? Like, is there any direction on when to make those calls? Well, no, not really. I mean, they're just supposed to like space them out. I said, okay. So then we started actually talking to practitioners. I heard everything from, well, I'll make 3 calls in a day because I got to get this case moving and I don't have more time than that. Well, if she's at work all day and you made 3 calls all day, right? So they called virtually like 90% of victims, but they were only getting in touch with a small handful of them, right? So yeah, they were making the calls, but they weren't getting in touch with anybody. So the source of the problem was no direction. Yeah, make 3 phone calls to try and get a hold of the victim, but there was no direction on how to do that, right? So that's something we had to build into that response so that there was the likelihood of getting in touch with more survivors to let them know what they were doing and why they were doing it. Because a lot of the survivors in the focus group said we were completely in the dark. We didn't know where the case was. We didn't know if he was going to get released. We didn't know if he was going to the men's program. We didn't even know where he was living, right? Because we could never get a hold of probation, or they didn't get a hold of us, right? Okay, next slide, Teresa. All right. So when you're partnering on institutional changes, you got to have some trust, right? An agency is just not going to open up their doors and say, here's our policies and protocols, have at it, right? You're going to have to find a way, and within the way that we talk about organizing, there's a strategy on how you build trust within an agency. There's things that you do. There are definitely things you don't do if you want to hold on to trust in that space. You want to do a lot of sit-alongs. You want to do a lot of ride-alongs. You want to spend time as an organizer learning the job of everybody you're going to be interacting with before you ever start coming up with suggestions on how to change things. If you walk into the police department, if you walk up to a child protection worker, basically cold, and say, hi, I'm an advocate working in the CCR grant that we got, and there's some stuff that we'd like to change, it ain't gonna work. They don't need you. Government agencies, faith-based church systems don't need you. They can do what they do, whether you exist or not. So if you want to have access, you need to find a way to build some trust and have an understanding of the space that you're walking into. And every agency has a different culture. Again, I just keep going back to the faith-based community because we did a lot of work with them. Every church has a different culture. You have to know what all those are and basically flex yourself to fit in to that culture, both in what you write and what you suggest and how you come to it. And in the process of all of this, you're going to find allies in those spaces who are going to be able to give you direction. Okay, now don't say it that way inside of our agency because it's not going to fly. Say it this way. This is how they're going to hear it because this is what we really value, right? So say it, frame it in this context, right? So those allies that you learn with doing those ride-alongs and sit-alongs about, they can really be helpful in helping you organize within those spaces. Institutionalize the change by creating policy, protocols, structural shifts. We talked about that. Policy should be centered on the needs of survivors and improve the ability to hold offenders accountable while improving the work experience of the practitioner. So there's three things. There's safety, there's accountability, and the work experience of the person doing the job has to be better. That's the three-legged stool. If you can do that, you are likely to create a sustainable response. If you can't, if you just go to an agency and say, I need you to do something, it's going to be about 20% more work on your part, but I think it'll end up in more safety. I'm almost assured to tell you that it won't, if you even get it past the command, it won't last because it's not sustainable. It has to improve the work experience of the practitioner. And the only way to do that as a community based agency is to partner with them because they know their jobs better than I do. How do we make your jobs better, right? And do these other two things. And I should say, when I talk about accountability, I'm not talking about jail or prison. I'm talking about a consequence. I'm talking about coming up with something that incentivizes the individual to go to and stay in a rehabilitation program, right? Because we know in Duluth, by tracking these guys for years, that if we can get them through the entire CCR and everything that's mandated, CD treatment, men's program, mental health if he needs it, right? If we can get him through those processes, the recidivism rate goes way down, right? But if he doesn't, if he quits, if he bails, if he's gone, recidivism rate goes way up. So we are trying to incentivize these individuals. So here's an example in Duluth, basically to try and get rid of the criminalization of this. We need an incentive. Freedom in our country is one of the only things we have to incentivize, unfortunately. So the arrest is made, they're processed in court, and we have a thing called stay of adjudication. Most states do have some version of this. So we are going to stay adjudicating this crime if you do all these things and successfully complete them. If you do that, your crime goes away. If you don't do that, you've already pled guilty and we just reinstitute the guilty verdict and now you're convicted, right? So the incentive is to maintain a clean record, right? That's the idea. In other countries, they viewed housing as leverage to get them to go to a rehab. We'll take your housing from you. If you don't do what we're going to tell you to do, right? There's any way there's fly-in communities that I've been to where the incentive is you don't get to stay here. We are going to fly you out of here, and you're not going to be allowed back if you don't do what you need to do to turn things around, right? You need some incentive for this population to do the work that's required. All right, next slide, Teresa. This is all of the different puzzle pieces that I'm talking about when you're talking about how to change a system beyond policy and protocol. So rules and regulations, that would be the policy and protocol piece of it. But how are then, if you're going to change the way what they do, how are you going to link that work to all these other agencies formally. What resources do they have? What resources do they need to actually do what you're suggesting? This is one of the biggest gaps in organizing. They want to do all this stuff, but they don't have the resource base to do it. And in Duluth, our police reports average between 15 to 20 pages long, right? We can do that because of how we dictate reports. But if you're going to handwrite reports, you're not going to have a 15 to 20 page police report. It's not going to happen, right? So you're going to have to pare down what's expected of an officer to collect at the scene, right? Based on the resource allocation that you have. Or find a new resource allocation to beef that up. Education and training, typically the last thing we do. A lot of folks want to train people out of bad practice. I can tell you personal experience and decades of work in Duluth, it is not going to happen. It is not going to happen. It's not going to happen. They need more training. No, they don't. They need a different policy to work under. And then they need to be trained on the new policy, right? So there are people within a training that are going to take it to heart. They're going to do something different. It's going to work for them. But if you want a department to do a similar thing, given a similar set of circumstances across the board, then you're going to need a policy that tells them they need to do it. You're going to need a protocol that tells them how to do it. And you're going to need to have a way of supervising it to make sure it happens. If you miss one of those things, it's probably not going to work. Concepts and theories, every policy has an idea behind it, a notion, a theory, right? Does it line up with the shared understanding about the problem that you're trying to embed in the way the community responds? They all have a mission, purpose, and function, which we'll give you an example of in a second. Accountability. Who's the agency accountable to, right? And in a CCR that we're talking about, the agency has to be accountable to the survivor. How are they accountable to the survivor? How are they accountable to the other agencies? And how are they accountable to the due process of the offender, right? So multiple ways in which accountability gets built in to how they respond. And then administrative practices. One of the most fascinating things in my work is to go through and see how paperwork either expands or limits people's understanding of the problem, right? Standing in a courtroom, probation officer has a thing. Your Honor, it's a sentencing hearing for Mr. Anderson. Mr. Anderson is a longtime school teacher in Duluth. He has been a teacher for 25 years. He is also does a lot of volunteer work at his church. You know, it's like a citizenship report. How does this report linked to what he did to his wife? Right? Like, I don't like how. So when you ask the probation officer, why did you choose to tell the judge this information as opposed to what he did? And the agent says, well, that's because I'm just filling out a form here. This is what's on my form. Oh, so if I want you to say something different, then I got to change your form, right? Because that's what's dictating what you communicate. Like, it's just fascinating, right? Okay, let's get an example. Next slide, Teresa. So mission, purpose, and function. The mission concerns the overall goals of the organization, right? So what are they now? And what do they need to be to shift to a CCR format? Purpose refers to the specific processes within the mission, right? How do they execute it? And then function of the practitioner in a specific context. What is their function, right? And how is that going to shift within a CCR format? So next slide, Teresa. This is the Duluth Police Domestic Violence Policy, Purpose, and Scope. So a new officer sits down after 2 days of domestic violence training as a new recruit and now reads the Duluth Police Policy. This is, in a sense, the preamble. This is what sets the tone for everything that they will do in that report. The department is committed to engaging in a comprehensive approach to intervening in domestic abuse incidents. The investigation of these cases sets the foundation for almost every subsequent action by the courts and community-based agencies. It is the cornerstone of an effective, coordinated interagency response. The intent of the law and of this order is to protect victims from ongoing domestic abuse, right? Every single policy that we've written for a government agency has this at the beginning of the policy, has some version of this that's tailored to what that agency is responsible for doing, right? So everybody knows the point, the purpose of why they're doing this. It isn't just to execute a job, that they are part of a larger response, right? Okay. And you would be, well, you might not be amazed, but how long it takes to come to an agreement as to what this says, right? With each agency. Okay, next slide. All right, expand understanding of the problem. Who needs to be involved? So who controls access to practitioners and administrative details, right? Typically command, right? So command might not be part of a lot of your actual organizing work, but they need to know what you're doing, and they need to know, and they need to grant you access. They need to grant you the space to talk to people and find out what you need to find out to do the work you're going to do. How will focus groups of survivors, offenders, or frontline practitioners expand the understanding of the problem, right? So you've got this problem, right? Women are calling because OFPs on OFP violations and nothing's happening. Okay, I don't know why that's the case. If we got a whole bunch of women saying this is the problem, we got a bunch of advocates saying it's been a problem for years, they're all going to have opinions as to what they think the problem is. And typically it's going to be character flaws and everybody else. But what actually going in to find out, I was in Virginia, the state of Virginia, and I'm sitting in a room, CPS is on one side, law enforcement's on the other, and literally there is no crossover down the middle of the aisle. And I could feel the tension in the room. So I just stopped the training. I said, you know, there's something that's happening in this room. I can feel it. I don't know what it is, but I don't think we can continue until somebody tells me what the problem is. So I said, I'd like to start with CPS. How would you like to talk about what I'm feeling here? And they said, you know what? Child sexual abuse is a pretty darn important problem. And when we call for help, they don't respond. I mean, I can't believe how cold you got to be to ignore a child who's been sexually abused, right? And they just kind of went on. I can see law enforcement slowly elevating off their chairs, right? Because they're irritated. And I said, okay, so I got it. Law enforcement, what's your idea? Now, this is just 15 minutes in a training, right? Law enforcement, what's your way of talking about this? Look, here's the thing. I get that these are huge problems, but I have a call priority list. And believe it or not, child sexual abuse is not a priority call in my department. The chief sets that. We don't, right? If the chief said that I have to put a flower in my mouth and drive around all day, I'd voice my complaint, put the flower in my mouth and drive around all day. That's how we operate. So I don't get to pick. If you want to, don't tell me that I don't care about kids, right? So now here's an example, right, where two siloed agencies are pointing the fingers, right, and then don't understand what the actual problem is, right, that can be fixed. That's the work of the organizer. I don't take on judgment. I don't judge. I just go in and I try to figure out what the problems are, right? Where do they originate? What has to be changed so that this isn't a problem going forward, right? And I'm telling you, every agency has low performing individuals. We all got them, right? That's not the problem. The problem is what's informing those people in that agency to do and how to do it. That's where your problems are going to lie, right? It could be a form, it could be a policy, it could be a protocol, it could be a lack of all three, right? And everybody's using their own discretion. That could be the problem, right? But there's a systemic way to change it. All right, next slide, Jeff. Or next slide, Teresa. All right. So I want to skip, Teresa. I want to skip this one, the next one, the next one, and just go to this slide. So the previous three slides are basically laying out questions that you should be asking if you're going to do focus groups for planning one, conducting one, and analyzing the results, right? Kind of takes you through those 3 steps. And you can read those. If you want follow-up on those, we can talk about those. You can call me or contact us, but it's critical. We spend half a day on how to conduct focus groups. There's a way we ask questions. There's questions we don't ask, right? If you want to get at what the systemic problems are, right? So again, lack of time, we're 1 minute left, and I just want to say this is kind of what we see, as I mentioned earlier. 2 different times that we've done this, takes a lot of time and effort, but we're looking at reoffense back into the civil or criminal system. Now, I know that reoffense is not always the best way to think about men's use of violence, but it's important to the system, because I'm going to systems, government systems, and asking them to do things sometimes vastly different than what they're doing. Spend more time on domestic assault, sexual assault cases than they might have been spending before. They want to know, are we making a difference, right? Is my docket or my police calls or my CPS families, am I going to see less of them because I'm going to do this work, right? And in this regard, we can show, yeah, you're going to see it. But here's the thing. If we don't do the work to get him through the CCR, which means everything that is at the beginning and everything that's at the end, which is typically community-based programs. If we don't do that, if probation isn't saying you got to go or there's a consequence, and then he just quits, right? Then your recidivism and your repeats are going to come back. The other piece to this is that when you look at this analysis in detail, you find out that about 50% of the reassaults are happening between 20% of the reoffenders. So there's a small minority of guys that are committing most of the reassaults. And when you look at the profile of those men, it's typically guys who have the worst child abuse histories, early drug and alcohol use, early criminal histories as juveniles. They trust no one. They don't trust their parents because often their parents were the offenders in their lives. So that's a much harder population. And we've developed a restorative response that layer onto that for those individuals. And we're having some success, but not what we'd hoped. So that work is evolving to try and figure out how we reach that 20% that most communities have that commit most of their reoffenses. But again, when you do this work, you know that now. You know who they are. You know what the struggle is, so that you can try to design a different way of responding. If you're not doing this work, you just don't know why everybody keeps coming back time and again. Well, not everybody does, by the way.